Our next speaker before lunch is Danielle Chi. Danielle is the Regional Wildlife Program Leader for the Intermountain region of the Forest Service in Ogden, Utah. She holds a master's degree in psychology from San Diego State University and a PhD in wildlife biology from Utah State University. Her graduate research focused on carnivore behavior, particularly related to human-wildlife interactions. She has been in her current position since 2005 and represents the Intermountain region of the Forest Service as a member of the National Lynx Biology Team.
Okay, I wanted to thank the committee for inviting me to speak here, and I also wanted to thank John for going first, because a lot of what he's presented in his presentation will feed into or has provided a basis for what I'll be talking about today, and that's the status of lynx conservation on forests in the Intermountain West. And I also want to preface that even though I'm talking about this, it's really the result of over 10 years of work that have been that's been conducted by a range of people, biologists, silviculturists, bioecologists, etc., from a variety of different agencies, including John. And so this really is a result of their work, not necessarily mine. Okay, so what I want to do is first to give you a kind of a broad overview of the conservation history of lynx, first to talk about a little bit of the listing factors, some early conservation efforts, and then what the Forest Service is doing now to apply conservation on the landscape. And then we have to dive into the weeds a little bit, and I want to talk about one conservation strategy in particular, the Northern Rockies Lynx Management Direction. It's the direction under which many of the forests in the Intermountain West are currently under, and speak a little bit to progress and challenges in implementing that direction. Okay, so lynx were proposed for listing in 1998. In 2000, the Fish and Wildlife Service formally listed the contiguous U.S. distinct population segment of lynx as threatened. In the Federal Register notice, which is shown here, they concluded that the primary factor threatening this DPS was the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms, and in particular that was the lack of conservation direction for lynx in Forest Service and BLM land and resource management plans. So in anticipation of the listing, a number of federal agencies, including the Forest Service and state agencies, initiated a broad interagency effort. And as part of that effort, there were a couple products that were completed very, very quickly. One of which is referred to as the science report. John referred to this book in his talk as well. The science report was a comprehensive review and interpretation of the science that was out there on lynx to date, mostly coming from Canada and Alaska at the time. We had some research coming out of Washington as well. But again, compiled by an international team of experts on the species and its ecology. And then information from the science report then fed into development of the lynx conservation assessment and strategy, which is shown on the right. This was compiled by an interagency group of biologists. They're referred to as the Lynx Biology Team. And what this document did was take information from the Lynx science report and to compile a list of potential risk factors to lynx, as well as conservation measures that might minimize some of those risks. And then based on a conservation agreement that the BLM and the Forest Service had with the Fish and Wildlife Service that was signed in 1989, BLM and Forest Service essentially committed to avoiding all adverse effects, or at least minimizing effects to lynx, by considering information out of the science report and also applying the conservation measures from the LCAS, and that's what I'll be referring to it from here on out, until the time where their land management plans and resource management plans had been formally amended to incorporate that conservation direction for lynx that was lacking at the time of listing. So here are some of the risk factors that were outlined in the LCAS. There were 17 some odd factors. kind of grouped by the nature of effect, those that affected lynx productivity and recruitment, those that could result in direct death of lynx, those that impacted lynx movement or dispersal, and then some kind of a hodgepodge of factors that mostly related to concerns related to habitat fragmentation and connectivity. And so these factors that are outlined in red were some of those that were kind of the biggest concern to the federal land managers at the time that the LCAS was completed. Another thing that the LCAS required was that all forests map those vegetation types that contributed most to lynx habitat. And they were required to take into consideration various geographic differences in vegetation, composition, elevation, etc. And then based on the distribution and the configuration of habitat to delineate lynx analysis units. And the lynx analysis unit was intended to approximate about the size of a home range for a female lynx. And there are a number of criteria that were used to do this, but in general, those lynx analysis units were intended to encompass large, contiguous patches of habitat ranging in size between about 16,000 and 25,000 acres of habitat. The intent here was to provide some kind of unit that the agencies could use to evaluate the effects of their projects on individual lynx, as well as to provide kind of a spatial framework for protecting and conserving habitat across a landscape for multiple lynx. Okay, well, as I mentioned, the LCAS had a number of conservation factors to try and minimize some of these risk concerns. There were like at least 30 plus different standards and guidelines each, so way too many to talk about here. But they tended to revolve around three basic goals, which I'm going to try and clearly describe. The first was really to maintain habitat to support lynx and their prey species both locally, which would be at the scale of the Lynx Analysis Unit or LAU, and then also across the landscape. And so there were a couple of recommendations that were provided to do this. One was that timber harvest activities were to be limited in those LAUs where more than 30% of the habitat was in an unsuitable condition. So we didn't want to create more unsuitable habitat in an LAU that was currently lacking. The second approach was to try and limit harvest to not changing more than 15% of habitat to an unsuitable condition over a 10-year period. So we didn't want to have a concentrated effect over time. And then lastly, there were limits to pre-commercial thinning in suitable habitat, focused primarily on those younger stands that John had talked about that were thought to be important for providing for snowshoe hares. Another goal focused on minimizing opportunities for competitors, and this really revolves around this concern that certain types of activities like snowmobiling and grooming of trails and roads in winter could compact snow and facilitate access by other competitors like coyotes into lynx habitat, which could then allow them to exert sort of a competitive pressure on lynx. The last general goal was to maintain habitat connectivity so that basically movement of lynx across the landscape was not impeded. So those were kind of general principles of the LCAS. It was intended to be an interim strategy until BLM and Forest Service resource management plans were formally amended or revised to include guidance. The Forest Service has moved forward with that in a couple of different ways. During the first 4 or 5 years, there were a number of forests that individually amended and revised their plans. So they just directly pulled in a lot of the concepts from the LCAS into their land management plans. And then in 2007, the Northern Rockies Lynx Management Direction was signed, and this simultaneously amended 18 national forests across 4 different states. The Southern Rockies Lynx Management Direction quickly followed suit, and that amended 8 forest plans in Colorado and Wyoming. And I think now we have somewhere around 6 or 7 forests that are still under the LCAS, and they still have to revise to incorporate that formal guidance to address that initial risk factor in the listing, that was the inadequacy of regulatory mechanisms. So now I want to talk more about the Northern Rockies direction, and I'll probably refer to it mostly as the amendment just for ease. And we are going to have to get in the weeds here, I apologize, before lunch. But this amendment was pretty broad. It's the direction under which many of the forests in the Intermountain West are under. And because it was so broad also, it covered a wide range of habitat conditions, which has created some of its own issues. So again, it was signed in 2007, and the goal here was to promote conservation and recovery of lynx while taking into consideration various multiple-use activities that were outlined in existing forest plans. So there was definitely this multiple-use component. It covered 18 national forests, as I indicated, 40 million acres of national forest system lands, of which almost half were mapped as lynx habitat, of which about 8 million fell outside of designations like wilderness. So about 8 million acres of mapped lynx habitat were going to be most impacted by the direction in this amendment. And then lastly, I just want to bring this up reluctantly, but there was a stipulation applied that the direction would only be required in forests that had occupied mapped lynx habitat. And basically, occupied was based on current records of lynx since 1999 and evidence of reproduction. So here you can see in black, this is the whole planning area here. The areas that are outlined in black are those that are considered occupied. Those areas that are outlined in gray, and that also includes this area down here, the Ashley and the Bighorns, those are considered unoccupied. This issue of occupancy has brought up some of its own issues. Unfortunately, I can't get through all of them today, but I did want to mention that this was only applied in occupied mapped lynx habitat. Okay, so the amendment basically boiled down those 17 risk factors to 4 general areas that are listed here. Livestock management, human use projects, which included recreation, energy development, roads, this concern with linkage area and habitat fragmentation, and then, of course, vegetation management, which includes timber harvest, fuel treatments, and prescribed fire. And I just want to say that, we didn't have as much information when the LCAS was first developed. And so based on new analyses that have been conducted by the Fish and Wildlife Service and new research coming out of the lower 48, basically some of these factors, livestock management and human use projects, were sort of downgraded in concern under the amendment. That's not to say that they don't impact individual lynx at time, but they weren't considered a primary threat to populations. There was still a concern with respect to linkage, but the primary concern was still around vegetation management and the threats that those activities pose to the forested communities that provide for lynx and snowshoe hare. So many of the conservation measures of the direction or the amendment are really focused on vegetation management and tend to be relatively restrictive, and that's where I want to go here. Okay, a lot of words. Focus on the ones in red. These are some of the objectives that we had for vegetation management. And again, they really boil down to trying to manage vegetation where we are managing to mimic natural processes like succession and disturbance processes while we're also maintaining lynx habitat. In addition, try and create a mosaic of landscape conditions, including these younger stands, maybe surrounded by stands that are in an older condition to ensure that we have habitat maintained over time. And then lastly, if we are going to do active management, focus on those areas that are not currently providing good conditions for snowshoe hares or lynx. Right, there are a number of standards that were included to try and address these objectives. The first 3 you've actually seen before from the LCAS, and they really focus on management in those younger stands. So there was this 30% rule here, which basically limited activities in LAUs that had more than 30% of their habitat in an unsuitable condition, minimizing impacts to no more than 15% of habitat over time, and then lastly, these limits on pre-commercial thinning. And so again, these came from the LCAS, but there were some changes. There were some exceptions to these. First, for this vegetation standard S5, There were exceptions for treatments in aspen, white bark pine, as well as impacts to habitat that could occur like around admin sites or for research. In addition to that, all three of these had exceptions for fuels treatments in wild and urban interfaces, up to about 16% of habitat on the unit. And so all the forests were essentially asked to estimate how much habitat they thought could be impacted by these exceptions, and then that estimate was provided to Fish and Wildlife Service, who then analyzed the effects in their biological opinion on the amendment. There was one last standard that was included. It was in response to some of the research that John just described, and that was that some of these multi-storied older stands were showing to be very, very important for lynx, particularly because they provided good habitat for snowshoe hares in winter. And so to respond to this pretty important conservation concern, the Forest Service included this last standard, which essentially precludes all vegetation management projects that would reduce snowshoe hares in these multi-storied stands. There were very few exceptions to this. You could move forward with projects in the wild and urban interface, but generally it was pretty restrictive. But in addition to that, this kind of condition, this multi-storied state, was thought to be pretty rare across the landscape, and so it was anticipated that generally implementation of the standard shouldn't impact a lot of the planning area. There were some exceptions, but generally it wasn't considered to be a real concern. Okay, so it's been about 3 years since that direction's been signed. You might ask, how's it going? Most of the standards and guidelines, like I mentioned, came directly from the LCAS, and so the forests were pretty familiar with them. They've been implementing them for the last 7 years, so we didn't have a lot of problems there. In addition, the direction had downgraded a lot of the previous risk factors, so they weren't as much of a concern, and in addition to that, the direction also allowed for some adverse effects, which was not the case under the LCAS. So projects did move forward now, where previously they may have been prohibited. The primary hiccup really came with this new vegetation standard that prohibited activities in multi-storied stands. And so I want to talk more about this. The issues that have come up sort of revolved around mapping resolution issues, issues associated with trying to assess that multi-storied stand condition, and then lastly with treatment in aspen. And it's easiest to use a forest as an example of what really these issues involve. And so here's a picture you've seen before, and I didn't go over it very well, but this is the Bridger-Teton National Forest here. It encompasses 3.4 million acres. And one of the initial concerns of the Bridger-Teton right out of the gate was that because of the restrictiveness of this vegetation standard, they were going to be able to do very, very little across their forest. And so you can see why they might be concerned. Of most of the forested landscape that they have across the BT, which is 80% of the forest, approximately 73% is mapped as lynx habitat. And in addition to that, based on a properly functioning condition assessment that was completed in '99, a number of the vegetation types that were mapped as lynx habitat on the forest, like lodgepole pine, spruce fir, and then also some aspen as well, are in a later stage, an older stage or mature stage of development. And so they were likely in those stages that provided that multi-story condition. So the concern was a valid one. Another thing pops out then when you look at this map, and it's the same thing. Wow, they have a lot of mapped lynx habitat. They also have some odd 40 LAUs that are mapped out here. So again, the LAUs were intended to approximate the home range of a female lynx. So based on that, you would think we should have a lot of lynx out there. And as John indicated, that just isn't the case. Generally speaking, based on historical records and also on recent telemetry points, lynx seem to focus their use of the Bridger-Teton in very particular areas. and that suggested to us that lynx habitat's probably more limited than we originally had thought, and we likely overestimated habitat. So what might be the cause of some of this overestimation? Some of it, I think, has to do with the resolution of the vegetation layers that were initially used. Those vegetation layers were relatively coarse in scale. They were probably not intended to be used to evaluate effects of projects necessarily on the ground. When you look at map lynx habitat, which is here in red, this is based on that early vegetation layer. You can see that it misses some areas that are clearly forested, but it also includes a lot of areas that are very open and probably will never be forested and will not provide lynx habitat in the future. The BT does have a new vegetation layer that was developed in 2007. Just some playing around with that layer, and the model for maps lynx habitat suggests it's probably going to be a better fit. So for the time being, the BT is moving forward with trying to refine that map. Another error or issue with overmapping probably had to do with the vegetation types that they included in that initial model. There were a number of types like dry dead fir, some juniper that were included, and so it's most likely that dropping some of those vegetation types out will also winnow down map lynx habitat on the forest. And so, like I said, they're moving forward with refining their map. I just want to say this is not something exclusive to the Bridger Teton. A lot of forests initially tend to be over-inclusive in mapping habitat. I think the idea was that being overprotective was a positive thing, and unfortunately that actually isn't the case. What happens when you overmap is you tend to inflate the baseline, the baseline conditions for lynx, and so when you actually have a project that's in real lynx habitat, you're going to underestimate the impact. So it's really important that we get these maps refined. Okay, another question that has come up is how exactly do you determine when a stand that's multi-storied provides that horizontal cover that is so important for winter snowshoe hares? And this didn't just come up on the Bridger Teton, it came up from a number of forests. And so one of the efforts that we're involved in now, the Bridger Teton, or the Lynx Bio team, is trying to develop some guidance to help forests do exactly that. And so what they've drafted so far includes some methods for measuring horizontal cover, including a cover board, the same cover board that was used in some of John Squire's research. Some sampling methods, randomized plot designs, and some sampling intensities, and then also some horizontal cover thresholds that were based on some of this work out of Montana that varied whether you were making those measurements in winter or summer. And so the one thing I want to point out here is this guidance is a really good first step in trying to help the forest deal with this standard. It does need to be considered a work in progress for any of those of you out there who may be familiar with this guidance. Some issues in implementation have come up, especially in Wyoming and Colorado. So the bio team is trying to kind of refine this guidance to ensure that it takes into account geographic differences in vegetation composition, and also that the sampling regime is really sufficient to accurately depict the conditions on the ground. Okay, good timing. The last issue that has come up has to do with treatment in Aspen. So here are some Aspen stands on the Bridger Teton. You can see you've got kind of a mid-stage or overstory of aspen here, intermixed with some younger subalpine fir, some other older stages of fir. You've also got a multi-storied stand here with spruce fir, and then you've got some of the older aspens intermixed in there. These aspen stands are considered at high risk on the forest. They're being lost to type conversion, probably as a result of the loss of disturbance processes. And so because of that, because they're considered high risk, they're also a really high priority for treatment. They're also a big interest for treatment by some of our partners, including the state agencies and other folks that are interested in regenerating aspen. And we've heard in this conference some of the concerns just regarding aspen health west-wide. So we recognize this is a concern. The other issue, though, is that these stands are multi-storied in general. They tend to be old or mature in age class. That was another factor that came out of that properly functioning condition assessment, that their aspen stands were in these older age classes. And they also provide that dense understory that provides good horizontal cover, which may provide good snowshoe hare habitat in winter, which actually we know it does provide good snowshoe hare habitat in winter. This is some work that was conducted by Nate Berg, actually out of Utah State. He looked at the relationship between a variety of these different forest types. There were single-story lodgepole pine with a variety of different stem densities, and then 4 multi-storied forest types, including aspen, spruce fir. And what he did is looked at the relationship between these types and a number of different forest structural attributes, including horizontal cover, and then also prey densities, including snowshoe hares. And what he found was that as a group, these multi-storied stands basically provided pretty well for snowshoe hares. And so you can see here that aspen, on average, supported 1.46 hares per hectare. And not surprisingly, he found also that these stands that were providing for snowshoe hares were also characterized by a high degree of horizontal cover. So this new research has sort of brought up a new issue for us in conservation of lynx, and that's what do you do with these mixed conifer spruce, the spruce fir aspen stands that are providing very, very well for snowshoe hares. We also know that some of these are providing very well for lynx. In fact, I think one of the pictures in the previous slide, there was a documentation of lynx killing snowshoe hare in that stand. So they're providing well, but they also are really a target and a priority for treatment, both for forest health issues and a number of other issues. So it's created this dilemma. I think the forest is moving forward and trying to see where we go from here. I think it's going to require an interagency, real interdisciplinary approach that involves silviculturists, experts in aspen, lynx, etc. So we're still a work in progress, but you'll see where we go from here. Okay, and so I don't have a lot of time. I just want to say this has been a real learning process, just implementation of the Northern Rockies Lynx Management Direction in general. The Southern Rockies really had the benefit of some of our errors or issues, and actually a lot of those issues I discussed had sort of cropped up early. And so they've been able to take advantage of that and to address those issues earlier. So with that, I'll take any questions if there are time.
I have 2 questions. One, the southern Oklahoma forest where I'm registered completely covered in LAU, but it's also managed by the bark beetle.
Yeah.
And the Southern Rockies Lynx Amendment being finished sort of before the bark beetle epidemic got to where it is. You said there are revisions going on with biology for health and use implementation.
Yes. One of the things I did want to bring up is the immovability of these amendments. And so even though the Lynx management or the Lynx bio team is working on trying to revise that guidance, if activities are restricted, it's going to be difficult to change that. And so I think one of the things, though, that I know they have been discussing is whether or not some of those stands where you have that pretty broad depth of an overstory, is that whether or not that's really providing that multi-story stand characteristic anymore. And so I think in looking at that, we're looking at options for maybe going ahead and moving forward with pulling out some of those trees, not maybe clearing it all off. We still want some of that structure, but I think they are moving forward with trying to figure out ways to do that.
And my second question, I guess it's for both you and for John. We recently had a scare with the Jeopardy call from the Fish and Wildlife Service on moving our roadside hazard trees. And since it was mentioned that lynx habitat is not usually adjacent to roads,
can't speak for Fish and Wildlife Service. I used to be able to, but I guess on first call, I wouldn't think that that treating those areas alongside roads would really be a very big concern. It's probably a very small proportion of the landscape, but two, it's probably habitat that's not as high a value, as other areas that are more remote. But John, maybe you can speak more to the road situation.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that there's no evidence that links avoid forest roads. Nor is there any evidence that links avoid snow returns that are compacted. And they use it for their expectations on both, so they don't avoid forest roads. I can't imagine some issues that are so stable that it's used.
You wouldn't imagine so.
Yes, Steve.
Has the Lynx bio team, I guess I would encourage the Lynx bio team to open the door and have communications with your Aspen experts on the forest to try to resolve this sort of dilemma we're in. And I say that because I'm concerned about Aspen on certain parts of the BT forest where I work in cooperation with the Forest Service for the last 25 years. And an example of that is the entire Grace River Ranger District around Aspen, where we inventoried 500,000 acres and found about 50,000 acres of aspen. I believe it was close to 78% was in high or highest risk by the panel particles which is in need of treatment. So we've got some advanced successional stages of aspen stands, and we certainly need 20 to 30% advanced successional aspen on the landscape, but maybe we don't need 80% of the aspen stands to be in advanced successional stages. I don't know if there's some horns locked there that we can, communicate across some disciplinary lines between aspen silviculturists and Lynx experts. We might be able to find some opportunities to resolve those differences.
Yeah, we talked about this before. I agree with you. I think one of the first steps we wanted the forest to move forward with first was let's be more accurate in what's really mapped Lynx habitat on your forest. And so, John talked about kind of the somewhat selective nature of Lynx, particularly on the Bridger Teton, and we're hoping that in refining or revisiting their mapping that there will be some areas that drop out. There may be some areas that do not, and unfortunately those may be some of those areas that are most desirable for treatment. And I think that's where I don't know if we're going to lock horns or we're just going to have to get in a room and try and work through whether or not we try and move forward and evaluate the effects to Lynx or whether we decide to stay out of those areas.
Last question.
Yes, I also have a concern about I work in the southern Rockies Lynx area. And like some of the areas of this Lynx habitat, yet again because of one of the ladies talked about, like we have like bark beetle issues like that, where the forests are crashing basically. And like the spruce beetle, that's what I'm working in currently. It's supposed to be Lynx habitat, yet there's supposed to be uneven age management for Lynx, yet that just doesn't work very well for the spruce beetle situation because if you try to do any treatments for the next entry, there's not going to be anything left there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what, whereas if you did an even age type of thing where you're going to do overstory removal, basically take off everything that's crashing, you may have a chance out there, I think, but it may be several decades out there before you can return to more of a Lynx habitat type of thing. It's just if you do nothing, there's nothing there to work with in the future.
Well, I think that some of the question is also related to what the BT is dealing with, and that would be, depending upon the state of the beetle kill, is it really providing Lynx habitat anymore? And I can't remember if I mentioned this, but one of the goals, or one of the objectives was, if we are going to actively manage, let's focus on those areas where the conditions for Lynx aren't all that great, but maybe they could be. And so that's one thing, hopefully more on the ground work. We're spending a lot of time in offices, whether you're in a district or whether you're in the DC office, it really doesn't matter. I think we need to be spending more time on the ground, really looking at what the conditions are to determine how to best move forward with treatment.
Especially appreciate Danielle's last comment. We need to spend more time on the ground. Amen.